say hello to everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Incentivizing War, Faith-Based Investors Calling for Accountability in the Defense Industry. My name is Jillianne Lyon. I am a program director at Investor Advocates for Social Justice, and I am very excited to welcome you all here today. We're going to be joined by some fabulous guest speakers who have been leaders in peace movements and calls for corporate accountability. And again, welcome to everyone joining. Our webinar is 1 hour total. It will consist of 45 minutes of presentations with a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along or use the raise the hand button during the Q&A session. This webinar will be recorded as a note and you will be sent the slides and recording following our event. To briefly introduce IESJ, we are a nonprofit organization representing faith-based institutional investors working to leverage investments to advance human rights, climate justice, racial equity, and the common good. IESJ and its affiliates have been engaging defense contractors for many years to encourage better management of critical human rights concerns. And before we jump into our wonderful presentations, I wanted to start this webinar off with a land acknowledgement, which is a formal statement that recognizes the land on which we're living and working, respecting Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards. So I am calling into you all today from Piscataway land, and I'm going to put a link in the chat if you want to learn more about land acknowledgements or where you're calling in from. And we feel this is especially critical as we're talking about militarization and nuclear weapons, acknowledging the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in peace movements and the disparate impacts these communities are burdened with. Now I am going to kick off our event with a reflection from Sister Ethel Howley, a school sister of Notre Dame, who has led the work on behalf of faith-based investors to engage defense contractors on their human rights risks. Sister Ethel was unable to join us today, but she has recorded a wonderful statement for us all to watch. So Ashley, if you're able to put up Sister Ethel's video. Oh, I'm unable to hear the audio. Is that the case for anyone else?
I have been invited to welcome you to this webinar, Incentivizing War, Faith-Based Investors Calling for Accountability in Defense Industry. I am Sister Ethel Howley, a school sister in Notre Dame, and I live in Bridgeport, Connecticut. All of us have been overwhelmed for more than a year with news concerning the death and destruction in the war in Ukraine. For several months, the evening news has brought our attention to the violence related to apartheid in Palestine. In light of these world tragedies and today's webinar, I will now offer some related thoughts for your reflection from Catholic social teaching, more specifically from Pope Francis. We school sisters of Notre Dame and other co-filers of the human rights proposals are Catholic institutional investors who have dedicated our lives and mission to advancing justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. 8 years ago, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis called us to look at the weapons industry. And so I will quote from Laudato Si. Despite the international agreements which prohibit chemical, bacteriological, and biological warfare, the fact is that laboratory research continues to develop new offensive weapons capable of altering the balance of nature. Politics must pay greater attention to foreseeing financial interests, prove most resistant to this effort, and political planning tends to lack breadth of vision. In other words, Francis calls for a change in production, in the politics, and in the financial industry. Pope Francis also speaks of weapons in a more recent letter, Fratelli Tutti, and calls us to another challenge. Growing interdependence and globalization mean that any reason to the threat of nuclear weapons should be collective and concerted, based on mutual trust. This trust can be built only through dialogue that is truly directed to the common good, and not to the protection of veiled or particular interests. With the money spent on weapons and other military expenditures, let us establish a global fund that can finally put an end to hunger and favor development in the most impoverished countries, so that their citizens will not have to resort to violent or illusory solutions, or have to leave their countries in order to seek a dignified life. And that's the end of quote. Here we are today as institutional investors to dialogue for the common good. Now, we who are faith-based institutional investors hold the belief that through engagement with portfolio companies, we can further align our resources to fulfill our mission to support systemic change. We see a clear moral responsibility for companies and investors to acknowledge the direct role the defense industry plays in perpetuating human rights damage in war and other conflicts. We see that all actors need to contribute to appropriate remedies. The most severe human rights impact of the defense sector is permanent and results in the loss of life. Our shareholders' proposals are supported by strong legal and financial risk arguments, and are an invitation to deeply examine the business model in the context of company human rights responsibilities. The proposals call the leadership to develop a new vision, which will reduce the company's business activities that cause death and destruction, while contributing a more positive vision for society. Pope Francis reminds us, all of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to her or his own culture, experience, involvements, and talents. And we school sisters of Notre Dame also look to our Constitution, which calls us, as the desire of Jesus that all be one becomes more fully our own, our striving for unity embraces all humanity and the whole of creation.
A really powerful reflection from Sister Ethel. I think a wonderful way to start off this webinar. And Ashley, if you're able to put the slides back up and advance to the next slide, thank you. I want to introduce our first speaker, Susi Snyder. So next slide, please. Susi is a program coordinator at the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. She facilitates engagements with and by the financial sector on nuclear weapons related issues. Susi also coordinates the Don't Bank on the Bomb project, and she's an expert on nuclear weapons with over 2 decades of experience working at the intersection between nuclear weapons and human rights. Thank you so much, Susi, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for welcoming me here today. It is super exciting to join you. And I'm really glad to be a part of this, and as always, to work with IASJ. and with investors around the world who are concerned either about the practices of companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons or about nuclear weapons in general, and finding this as a pathway to exercise that concern. If we go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we have done within ICANN is to talk about how the worldwide nuclear industry is constantly sort of scheming and looking to gain and maintain influence in the political discourse around nuclear weapons. And one of the key tools that we have to deal with nuclear weapons and the problem of this catastrophic weapon is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this treaty, which has been in force since January 2021, explicitly prohibits any form of assistance in the manufacture, development, or production of nuclear weapons. Now, that treaty is binding on the countries that have joined it. However, even countries that haven't joined do start to adopt the normative principles of that treaty. And we've seen this with other weapons prohibitions, that when you make a weapon illegal, people start to move away from the companies that produce it, or they start to move towards finding ways to help those who have been harmed by that weapon. And we expect that same process around the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is growing. And last year we had 5 new members join the treaty, and it's got almost half of all countries in the world that have signed on to either sign the treaty or ratified it at this point, which is pretty good for a treaty that's quite young. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things that we do in our work is we talk about how much money was spent on nuclear arsenals. And so we're currently updating our annual assessment. So we can see the spending in 2022, but in 2021, it's only 9 governments that have nuclear weapons. You know, most of the weapons are held by US and Russia. And in 2021, those 9 governments spent a total of $82.4 billion, which when you adjust for inflation, was $6.5 billion higher than the year before. And I just want to be clear, this was in 2021. So this was before Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. This is when, you know, we were still barely overcoming the COVID pandemic. And they spent $156,000 per minute on nuclear weapons. And because those numbers are inconceivable to an ordinary mortal like myself, that much money, that per minute spent on nuclear weapons, is enough to provide a year of healthcare for 50,000 children. It's enough to pay the salary for a year of 2 elementary school teachers. And 1 minute of nuclear weapons spending could provide 18 public housing units for a whole year. So just to help get a sense of perspective and what this money is going to, it's going to build bombs that are designed to indiscriminately murder civilians and are targeted at cities. But there's a reason, and it's not just governments that profit from this spending. If we could go to the next slide, please. All of this money and the things that we could do for it, it's tax money that gets spent on the production of nuclear weapons, but some of it goes into the private sector. And that creates an incentive to keep these weapons around by contractors who seek to profit from the production of these weapons. And I know Dan's going to talk about this more later, so I won't get into it too much. If we go to the next slide, please. But it's not governments alone that earn money to build nuclear weapons. About 35% of the overall spending around the world on nuclear weapons goes into the hands of private contractors. And that's what we're here to talk about today. In 2021, those private contractors got more than $30 billion in nuclear weapon-related contracts alone. Now, we all know private companies are less accountable than governments. Companies have a record, especially these have a record on delivering on their contracts late and often significantly over budget. And one of the things when I look at the contracts, because I poke through them because I'm nosy. When I look through the contracts, one thing that really amazes me is how often they are announced at one figure And then a couple of days, maybe a week later, there's a modification that's announced. And that modification increases the cost of the contract by 2, 3, 10, 15 times as much as was originally publicized. And these private companies have a motive to keep these weapons around. So they lobby to earn more contracts, finance think tanks to make sure reports about nuclear weapons do not talk about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but talk about increased concerns with nuclear arsenals and the need for more weapons, and the effort to achieve parity with every other country that has nuclear weapons. There's an incentive for these companies to do that. So let's look at who they are. The next slide, please. A lot of the weapons contractors are quite familiar to many of you, I'm sure. We all know Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics. We know Raytheon build weapons. Their job is to make tools that kill. Northrop Grumman's one of the bigger contractors. I'll talk about them in a minute. But Boeing and Airbus are often not considered nuclear weapon contractors. And I wanted to reflect on that because they're not usually included in the list of companies that people will exclude from their investment universe for the purpose of staying away from weapons producers. Because people don't think of Boeing as making bombs. They think of Boeing as making planes. Same thing with Airbus. But Boeing does produce about half of their annual turnovers related to weapons production. And Airbus is intimately involved in producing nuclear weapons for the French nuclear arsenal, similar to the ones that were test fired just the other day. Not nuclear explosions, thankfully, but missiles were test fired for the first time in quite some time in order to assert France's role as a nuclear weapons power. And it's important to remember these companies, we have to look at the whole picture, because it's not like they have an assembly line where they produce nuclear weapons and they just roll off the line fully formed. That's not what happens. They build specifically designed components only for use in nuclear weapons that are then assembled by yet another company. And so, for example, the Trident II D5 missile it's a nuclear armed missile that's currently circling the globe on both US and UK submarines. And there are thousands of these weapons, thousands of the bombs. And each one of them is 8 times more deadly than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And each one has at least 4 or 5 companies involved in its production. If we go to the next slide, please. One of those companies is Lockheed Martin. And Lockheed Martin is involved, it does missile production and what's called deployed system support. So that's when the system is out on the sea, Lockheed Martin will help to make sure that when you're ready to fire the missile, it will fire the way it's supposed to. And they have significant outstanding contracts for these key components, both with the US government, the contracts are all with the US government, excuse me. And they have about 1.9 billion in outstanding contracts with the US government. But for Lockheed Martin, nuclear weapons are not a big part of their overall work. In fact, it's less than 3% of their total backlog, their total outstanding contracts. So it's not a big deal for Lockheed Martin at the end of the day to stop doing nuclear weapons, but they do continue to push to keep nuclear weapons around because nobody wants to cut that extra 3%. And Lockheed Martin works on 2 main systems. So it works on the Minuteman III, which is an intercontinental ballistic missile. That's the kind of thing that you see in movies that launches from the silo and can reach its target anywhere in the world in 30 minutes or less. And it also works on the Trident system. And the fun fact that I wanted to share with you is that the UK, even though the system of the Trident system is also in use by the UK, the United Kingdom doesn't actually pay Lockheed Martin directly. The US negotiates and provides the contract, and then the UK pays the US, and the US pays Lockheed Martin. And to be honest, I haven't found out if the US government takes a cut off the top, but I'd be really curious if they did. And if anybody knows, please do get in touch. If we go to the next slide, please. Northrop Grumman is, I think, the largest of the nuclear weapon contractors, and it's got the most turnover related to nuclear weapon systems at about 14% overall. And they work on a bunch of different nuclear weapons. One of them is the B-61 gravity bomb. Now, that's a bomb that's dropped from airplanes. And the US stores a bunch of these in Europe, where they'd be dropped by pilots from Italy, Germany, Belgium, or Turkey, or the ones at the airbase about an hour from my house here in the Netherlands. And because of this practice of nuclear sharing, Putin just announced plans to do the same. And they just concluded training Belarusian pilots to accept control over Russian nuclear weapons to follow on to the same practice. That is a problem, and Northrop Grumman is a contributor to that problem. Northrop Grumman also makes a system called the Sentinel. Now, previously this was called the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, but I think there's been a lesson from a lot of good films to show that, if you call it something like GBSD, nobody cares, nobody wants to get involved. But if you call it Sentinel, it's your new nuclear weapon and it's much more saleable. And in the process of bidding on this new type, a whole new type of nuclear weapon, Northrop Grumman acquired a lot of other companies. And they did that in order to undercut others who are bidding for these weapons. And this has caused quite a bit of concern about monopolies in the defense sector. And other proposed acquisitions have been blocked by Congress because of those concerns. So even if you're not super concerned about the nuclear weapons that are prohibited by international law that Northrop makes, this process might actually undercutting other companies and acquiring more subsidiaries in order to secure contracts might be of concern because it reduces competition in the marketplace and also potentially reduces safety and oversight. If we go to the next slide, please. General Dynamics is the other company that we're talking about here today. And they work also on that Trident system. And the thing is with General Dynamics is that its estimated value, it takes about 1.7 billion in for nuclear weapons, and that doesn't relate to its work on submarines, which is a huge part of what General Dynamics does. And that's something to consider as well, because we've got a whole new generation of new nuclear armed submarines that are being built. If we go to the last slide, please. Most of the countries in the world support a global ban on nuclear weapons. And those countries, but there are a few countries and a few companies that spend billions to keep nuclear weapons in business. It's 82.4 billion for government agencies and private companies altogether that builds nuclear weapons. And they fund think tanks that write about nuclear weapons. They hire lobbyists to make sure policymakers approve enormous nuclear weapon budgets the next year. And it's all part of a nuclear weapon funding cycle. And I always think of it as a shadowy interplay between governments, private companies, think tanks, and lobbyists. But the story doesn't have to end in catastrophe. There's an alternative. There are things that can be done that are being done to change this narrative. And that's why we're here. So I'll leave it there and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much, Susie. I think you did a great job of putting the defense contractors into the broader context of society and our economy, which brings us to our next speaker who will be building off this narrative, Daniel Auble. Dan oversees databases tracking lobbying and the revolving door for OpenSecrets, the premier research group tracking money in US politics. Working in the money and politics space since 2003, Dan has investigated foreign political influence, political action committees, and the personal investments of politicians, and currently specializes in the political influence efforts of the defense industry. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here to share a bit with you about how weapons producers use political spending to influence policy questions in Washington, D.C. Just a little bit about OpenSecrets. We provide data on money in politics with the goal of informing voters and advocates to encourage accountability and transparency in the political system here in the United States. We research and present several types of political activity data. One of the biggest in terms of money is lobbying of the federal government, which amounts to about $4 billion in spending each year now. We only get disclosure in terms of lobbying for the direct attempts to influence government officials, meaning actual contacts with members of Congress and their offices and staff, as well as executive branch personnel. So things like grassroots campaigns or PR campaigns and advertising are not included in that figure. So 4 billion is actually an undercounting, and things like advertising, you may not see Lockheed Martin running a Super Bowl commercial, but if you've ever been to DC and gone through the subway station at the Pentagon, for instance, you know that it is actually literally covered from top to bottom in advertisements for weapons systems. And usually one company buys out the whole station. And it's really striking to see advertisements in the Pentagon, essentially, for these weapon systems. But even if when you limit to that strict definition of lobbying, the three companies we're focused on today with shareholder proposals, Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, they together spend about $35 million on lobbying. There's a team of over 150 lobbyists that they have at their disposal. And our research showed that in 2020, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon all reported lobbying the State Department specifically about foreign military sales. And Lockheed Martin also reported contacting the State Department, but didn't mention sales particularly in that regard. So these companies are contacting the officials at the State Department who are responsible for approving major foreign military sales and lobbying them about foreign military sales. The other major avenue of influence really is campaign contributions, and those are going to candidates and the parties, as well as to outside spending groups that can spend unlimited amounts to influence elections, and sometimes can do so without meaningful disclosure of who is paying for that activity, whether it's advertisements or get out the vote. The three companies we're talking about today spent at least $10 million on the midterm elections in 2022. And most of that money, around 3/4 of it, was directed to candidates by the company's PACs. And a PAC is a political action committee, which can make contributions using the company's name, though they have to raise the money from employees, so they can't use business revenue to do it, but they can make contributions in the company's name. And note that the PAC is usually run and controlled by the company's lobbyists. Our research has found that they also clearly target members of the congressional committees that oversee and fund them. Of the $20 million the defense industry gave to members of Congress in general during the 117th Congress, more than 1/4 of it went to members of just one committee, and that's the House Armed Services Committee, which is chiefly in charge of determining the budget, the National Defense Authorization Act. A third way that the industry accesses power in Washington is via the revolving door. And what we mean when we say the revolving door is the passage of people from government jobs to the private sector, and sometimes vice versa. Are some of our previous research on Pentagon employees who went on to be registered defense lobbyists found over 100 in the last few decades, and over 500 people with employment in Congress at the relevant congressional committees like Armed Services, Foreign Relations, and the Defense Appropriations subcommittees. Now, that's significant. You know, when most of the numbers I'm throwing around are millions and billions, 100 people doesn't sound like a lot, but these are highly paid, connected people helping companies navigate the policy machinery in Congress and the executive branch. And it's telling that 3/4 of the industry's registered lobbyists fall in this category of having experience and connections in the government that they're now paid to try and influence on the company's behalf. In addition, these lobbyists are giving themselves to campaigns. Sometimes they are running fundraisers. The PACs especially will sponsor fundraisers, but even individual lobbyists some of them give substantial amounts to campaigns. 4 of the top 10 lobbyists, who are the biggest political donors, have at least one defense client they work for. So these folks, you know, to kind of lay it out, these folks are giving themselves to politicians. They're in charge of directing the PAC money under the company's name. And then they are calling and seeking meetings with this very same politicians to sit down and push their perspective or their issues. And while we and others attempt to fill the gaps, there really is no publicly available official disclosure in a central place documenting the revolving door phenomenon. And other things like giving to dark money groups or politically active nonprofits that have virtually no disclosure about who is funding them, you know, those things exist. So additionally, pressuring companies to go above and beyond in documenting and disclosing all of their political activity is a vital step. So it's clear that the weapons manufacturers and their established customers around the world, and primarily the US government, are an important part of the influence machinery here in Washington, DC, that continues to sell billions of dollars worth of deadly weapons abroad. Other researchers have shown that they often end up being used not as the defensive deterrents that they were marketed as, but to fuel destruction in conflict zones around the world, places like Yemen and Syria and Ukraine. Of course, I should acknowledge that money in politics is not the only thing to consider here, as is usually the case with money in politics. There are, of course, many other factors shaping the policies governing international arms sales, including obviously national security and diplomacy and economic development, and the US's interests in specific regions. But it is clear that weapons manufacturers have a seat at the table when policy decisions are being made that they deem important to their business interests. So I'll close by saying, pointing out that unlike most other industries, these defense giants have a very limited customer base, the US government being the primary one. And even when they make major sales of weapons to other countries, they have to get the approval of the Pentagon and State Department and Congress as well, by their silence, approves these deals. And experts have shown that those arms end up being used, again, not as defensive weapons always, but to fuel destruction and contribute to human rights crises in many conflict zones around the world. So the political influence that they wield really enables an environment with a proliferation of weapons, not just in the hands of the US military, but all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really helpful to have those connections kind of laid out for us. And just a note to everyone to put your questions in the chat or prepare your questions, because we are going to be moving on to our final speaker, Erin Acosta. Aaron is a senior program associate at Investor Advocates for Social Justice, and he supports campaigns on labor rights, racial equity, and peace and demilitarization. As a California attorney with experience working in Latin America, Aaron brings a global perspective and a critical approach to IASJ's demilitarization work, engaging the defense sector.
Thanks, Jillianne, and thanks, Daniel and Susie, for your excellent presentations, just highlighting really this symbiotic relationship between defense contractors and the government, and the perverse incentives that creates. Ashley, you can go to the next slide, please. The purpose of my presentation is to really highlight the work that IASJ is doing in terms of shareholder advocacy on behalf of our faith-based investors. So this year, on behalf of our investors, we filed 3 shareholder proposals, as has been alluded to during the whole presentation so far, but Northrop, Lockheed, and General Dynamics. And essentially, the goals of these proposals are for defense companies to really adhere to and embed the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, in their policies and practices. And really, the UNGPs highlight the responsibility that companies have to respect human rights. And it's really important to emphasize that this responsibility is separate and apart from the US's own human rights due diligence, specifically in their export licensing. And I'll talk about this towards the end, some of the pushback we get from defense companies. The second goal is for these defense companies to end the production and sale of nuclear weapons. And kind of more of an overarching goal is for the defensive, the defense contractors to really, adhere to a defensive business model, not offensive, a defensive business model that promotes peace and doesn't incentivize conflict. I provided a quote from one of the sisters we work with, Sister Nora Nash, but we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to go into just a very high level look at the proposals we filed. And so the first one is Lockheed Martin. With this company, we filed on behalf of the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and we're asking the company to conduct a human rights impact assessment, which is one of the tools that is part of human rights due diligence. A human rights impact assessment asks the company to look at concrete human rights risks and violations, and helps them to to identify, to assess, and to address these human rights problems, violations in their operations, or that are linked to their operations even. Just a couple of examples of that we included in the shareholder proposal, and some of these were mentioned by Susie already, but Lockheed is the world's largest defense manufacturer. weapons from Lockheed have been linked to war crimes in Yemen, and Lockheed currently has $1.9 billion in nuclear weapons contracts. Just to give perspective on last year's AGM, or annual general meeting, the same proposal was filed for Lockheed, and it received 20.2% shareholder support. Next, please. Next slide, please. So General Dynamics is our second proposal, and we're asking the company the same thing as we did for Lockheed, which is to conduct a human rights impact assessment. The proposal was filed on behalf of the Franciscan Sisters of Allegheny, New York. And just to name a couple of examples for General Dynamics, similar to Lockheed, weapons from General Dynamics have been linked to war crimes in Yemen and Palestine. In this proposal, we also wanted to highlight the fact that these defense companies don't just, even though they're US based, they don't just sell through the US. And in the case of General Dynamics, we highlighted and we found a contract that was with the Saudi Arabian government to sell them $13 billion in military vehicles, but this was done through a General Dynamics subsidiary through the Canadian export licensing regime. So it's not just through the US export licensing, but could be through other countries as well. And as of last year, the company had outstanding $20.5 billion in nuclear weapons contracts. And so for this, well, actually for last year's AGM season, we filed a similar but a different proposal, and it was asking the company to provide more disclosure on their human rights due diligence process, which received 25.2% of shareholder support. Next slide, please. And lastly, our proposal on Northrop Grumman, which was filed on behalf of the School Sisters of Notre Dame. This is a new proposal for us, and we felt it was important to highlight. This is something obviously that Daniel mentioned in his presentation, but we're asking the company to provide an alignment report, which looks at the alignment between, on the one hand, the company's human rights policies that are published on its website, and on the other hand, its political activities. And we're defining political activities really broadly here to include both direct lobbying, indirect lobbying, political contributions, electioneering, donations to think tanks and social welfare organizations, for example. So it really covers a wide scope of activities that a company engages in to essentially to influence public policy. And just to give a few examples, last year alone, Northrop spent almost $11 million in lobbying, and this is direct lobbying. And there is there's a huge gap actually in the disclosure of their political activities. So companies are required to disclose lobbying, direct lobbying contributions, but they're not required to disclose a significant portion of indirect lobbying, which is also known as grassroots lobbying. So donations to think tanks, for example, or social welfare organizations, which are 501c4s, are not mandated, and there is a lot going on that's not really transparent. And this is the Northrop case is just one of is really just illustrating something common in the defense company or the defense sector, which is that these defense companies are actually shaping U.S. foreign policy and at the same time undermining a robust human rights due diligence, not only of their own human rights due diligence, but also of the U.S. government's. All right, next slide, please. So I wanted to close my presentation with just some of the false narratives that the companies are putting forth as we engage with them, whether that's through our dialogues with them or through written correspondence. the companies really try to push back against our attempts to encourage them to really respect human rights and to embed human rights due diligence throughout their operations. So the first thing we hear is that, you know, we comply with the law, with US export licensing requirements, and we defer to the US foreign policy. So I want to push back on that with a couple of points, and one of them is that the UNGPs, the guiding principles, they are a standalone responsibility for companies. Sure, there are responsibilities for governments as well, but the UNGPs highlight the responsibility of companies to respect human rights. And this is separate and apart from the US's export licensing or any other country's export licensing requirements. And the second thing is this is a misleading characterization because as Daniel mentioned, and as we've seen in our research, these companies are spending a lot of money on political activities that are actually, you know, they're playing an active role in shaping the foreign policy. And so they're not simply deferring to what the US thinks is the most appropriate course of action, but rather they're lobbying and trying to get their weapons sold with higher frequency. The second false narrative is that implementing the UNGPs can actually put the company at odds with the largest customer, which is the US government. And I want to combat this by just mentioning that the UNGPs are actually designed to help companies mitigate, or part of it is to help companies to mitigate their own risks. And there are significant material risks involved with, you know, if there are human rights abuses. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that the US policy actually shows that the UNGPs are really consistent and aligned with the company's responsibility to respect human rights. And specifically, the State Department published a National Action Plan on Responsible Business Conduct in 2016, and it's currently being revised right now. But in the original iteration of the National Action Plan, the State Department talks about the UNGPs being authoritative and being a floor rather than a ceiling. So the responsibilities that companies have at a minimum include respecting human rights. On to the next one. The third narrative is that nuclear weapons are not illegal under international law. And while the US is not, or has not ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as Susi mentioned, there is growing momentum, and this is, and the fact that they are included in a treaty does make it international law. So it's not completely true what these companies are saying. And there's also growing momentum, this normative uptake that nuclear weapons are illegal under international law. And just finally, to conclude, we often get told that the proponents, so us or the investors, that we disagree with US foreign policy objectives. And really, I just want to make it very clear that we file these proposals and we're looking at the actions, the policies and practices of the companies themselves. And we're asking the companies themselves to conduct their own separate human rights due diligence. We're not looking at what the US government is doing. And we're also asking for these companies to be transparent. So to show what they're doing, you know, behind closed doors to influence foreign policy. So I'll leave it there for now. I'll pass back to Jillianne.
Thank you so much. So that ends our presentations for today. I'm going to invite everyone to put your questions now in the chat or the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand and I will call on you. So feel free to stop sharing screen and have all our panelists come on video. Again, another big thank you to our amazing speakers who shared about their powerful work. I hope to keep the momentum going for this. So I see we actually do have a question in the chat. It is, what do the panelists think is the role of investors regarding their investments in national or regional development banks? For example, European Investment Bank that is reported to be linked to Airbus. Background to the question is that such development banks typically have a political mandate to finance certain businesses, and investors' roles may thus be limited. So opening that up to anyone who wants to give it a first response.
I'll jump in on that one, if you don't mind. I think it's a very good question because especially those developmental banks, they are politically kind of guided, if not necessarily politically responsible. So the oversights are always a bit tricky, and it's different in different locations. So there's no one size fits all answer. However, when they're talking about larger investments in large companies like Airbus, then there are a couple of things that should be considered. First is, what is the intent of the investment, and is there a sort of we always used to call it the doctor's note and attached to that investment? For example, limiting what those funds might be used for. Is its investment targeted for specific projects, or is it for general corporate purposes? And when it comes to companies that are involved in the production of weapons, including prohibited weapons, and especially prohibited weapons, maybe those investment banks should only provide those investments for specific projects and not for general corporate purposes. And that's a way to it's a workaround a little bit, but does sort of add additional pressure to these companies. Again, it is very tricky, and we don't find a lot of national development banks that do have investments in weapons companies. It's quite rare that we see that. But European Investment Bank is one, and Airbus is where they invest. And so this might be a way to kind of shift that. And if it doesn't work directly through the European Investment Bank, then the oversight body responsible for the EIB's overall investments is probably the best way to go. And then you'd have to deal with either the Commission or the Parliament of the European Union, which is its own special tangled web.
Thanks. Dan or Aaron, do you want to add anything to that? If not, it looks like we have someone raising their hand from the audience, Patrick and Margaret. So I'm gonna allow you to get on speaker and ask your question. So you should be able to go ahead and speak now.
I'm sorry, before I lost all of most of what Aaron Acosta said, and I forgot that I'd raised my hand. I fixed it now because I'm not on the phone, but is there going to be a recording of all this later? I hope so. I'm from Tucson, Wilf, and I know Susi knows Wilf well, so we're very happy to hear you today, but I would love to know if there's a recording of all of this. Will there be later available?
Yes, there will be a recording, and you'll get the slides as well after today's event.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll lower hand now, sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you for joining us. So we have another question in the chat. Somebody's asking if anyone knows, are there any 2023 shareholder meetings in person besides Northrop Grumman? They said they go to meetings to talk about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and last year placed a copy of the treaty in hands of the Northrop Grumman CEO, had an interesting conversation with her. But most of the meetings are online, so very hard to ask questions or speak out. Anyone want to respond to maybe more in general the role of those annual meetings? Go ahead, Aaron.
I could take a crack at the first part of it, probably. So if the question is referring to defense companies, as far as the three that we filed shareholder proposals with, you're correct, Northrop is the only in-person one. And I think it's probably a good time to mention that out of these three companies, the first AGM that's coming up is on April 27th, and that is Lockheed's AGM. And then we have General Dynamics AGM is on May 3rd, and it will be virtual. And then Northrop Grumman's will be on May 17th, and that's also, yeah, that one's in person. What am I saying? Lockheed is also virtual. So
Sure, thanks for that. I think also maybe a related question that we have gotten a bit is, so for these annual meetings, these proposals are filed and the company has to give a response to the shareholder proposals. And a lot of the narrative from the companies has been that this human rights due diligence or reporting on lobbying is actually a waste of resources and harmful to shareholder value. So would any of the panelists like to respond to some of those company arguments that managing human rights is a waste of resources?
I'm sitting here and I'm chuckling in a sort of an evil, like, conspiratorial way, and that the idea that that managing human rights or investigating human rights and is a problem for company profits. So it just speaks volumes to the companies themselves and the values that they give, the value they give to human rights overall. And I think that there's I mean, it's cynical, but it's not surprising, and I think it's worth pointing this out in a narrative that might, you know, go beyond that shareholder meeting, to where people understand that, you know, if the weapons these companies produce are often marketed as a way to defend human rights, then the ways in which they do so should make sure to protect human rights. And you can kind of pull apart that argument in that small way. But I'm sorry that I have a little bit of a cynical, you know, kind of Monty Burns like response to that one.
Thank you so much. I think we have kind of one last question I might ask each of the panelists to do their best responding, and also give any sort of quick wrap up remarks that you want to help end our event with. So Richard Denton has added a few questions to the chat, mostly looking at, you know, what can individuals do about this issue in addition to going to shareholder meetings? Maybe what other kinds of like banks or companies or shareholders are involved. So I think maybe to summarize that, if each panelist can just talk about what can be done on this issue. So maybe we'll go in the order of speakers. So Susan, Dan, and then Aaron.
Great. Well, the first thing is, like, please help people understand that they can do something, and raise, you know, if you have investments, make sure to raise, most people use advisors, and advisors, it's helpful for investment advisors to know that there are concerns about these companies and that they have an obligation to also vote on these resolutions in the way that you wish. And I think that's an important piece of it. And then, you know, the continued education of others in this process. And I know, Richard, that's something that you do and have been doing very, very well, especially involving your colleagues through Rotary. That is a key tactic and a key effort overall in these, especially now in these quite challenging times around the weapons companies. And the final thing I just want to conclude with, it's really key to look at this as from many different angles. And that's one of the coolest things we've heard today. So we've heard about them from the weapons production side, from the lobbying side, from the human rights side, and to understand that you won't agree with everyone on which is the right strategy, but you'll often agree that the company itself, maybe it's from a governance side, maybe it's from a labor rights side, has problems. All of these companies have problems. And that those problems need to start eating at their profits. And I think we can collectively undermine their profit making.
I mean, from our perspective at OpenSecrets, I think for investors specifically is to encourage transparency by these corporations, especially in the areas of influence that are not really disclosed as a handy database. Things like contributions to think tanks and you know, important executives with connections to the government and that type of thing. But more generally, I would say that educating yourself on these issues and sharing with others is important. And I would not underestimate how important it is, at least for us in the United States, to contact your members of Congress. You may feel like you're shouting into a void, but it's stunning how few people, regular citizens, interact with their members of Congress. And, as I think my presentation made clear, Northrop Grumman is talking to them, and so should you. And you should, share your perspective and ask them to explain why they're taking money from these corporations and, how that is affecting their positions on these issues.
Yeah, so I'm not going to say anything new here because Susie and Daniel said everything essentially. But yeah, I think, I'd start with saying education and awareness around the issues and raising our voices to push back against these false narratives that the companies are putting forth and their think tanks are putting forth as well. And as Daniel mentioned, yeah, don't be afraid to get involved in the political process by writing to representatives, senators, asking for reform in lobbying. And at the very least, I think investors can demand more transparency and disclosure around a broader array of political activities. So not just the government mandated, lobbying disclosure, but explanation of what those actually mean, disclosure of other indirect lobbying efforts as well. And then let the investors decide if the companies are actually practicing what they preach.
Well, thanks so much. I think that's a great way to end our event. Thank you everyone for staying with us for a few minutes past the hour. Again, you'll receive the slides and the recording. If you're an investor, know who votes your proxies and keep an eye out for these shareholder proposals going to a vote in the upcoming weeks. And thank you for joining us. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.